The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific Coast shooting range as Captain Sarah Chun pulled into the gravel parking lot. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, a habit she developed since the medication started. The Saturday ritual had become her lifeline, prescribed by Dr. Reynolds as part of her PTSD treatment. Shooting was supposed to help her reclaim control, though some days it felt more like fighting against her own body. Chun retrieved her rifle case from the trunk, the familiar weight of the Remington 700 providing momentary comfort. The custom modifications told a story she rarely shared anymore. Combat-grade adjustments, or patterns from deployments, a scope that had seen more than recreational use. She'd earned every scratch on that rifle during 3 tours that left her with 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star she kept in a drawer at home. The range facility hummed with weekend activity. Chun signed in, selected Lane 7, and began her setup routine with mechanical precision. Unpack the rifle, check the scope, lay out the ammunition, breathing exercises to steady her hands. The tremors had worsened this week, a side effect of the propranolol that controlled her anxiety but sabotaged her fine motor control. She learned to work around it. Mostly, the roar of a diesel truck announced new arrivals. 4 men emerged, their movements synchronized and confident in a way that screamed military even without uniforms. Navy SEALs, Chun recognized immediately from their bearing and unit stickers on the truck. They claimed lanes 5 and 6, adjacent to hers, their conversation loud and casual. Lieutenant Marcus Webb led the group, his voice carrying across the range as he directed his teammates. "Great, soccer mom's here for her Pinterest hobby," he said to the others, gesturing toward Chun with his chin. The 3 men with him, Kowalski, Torres, and Martinez, laughed as they unpacked expensive gear and compared equipment like boys showing off new toys. Chun ignored them, focusing on her sight adjustments and breathing patterns. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, exhale slowly. Her hands still shook. The first shot surprised her with how far it strayed from center, punching paper 6 inches left of target. The second went high. The third barely caught the outer ring. Behind her, the SEAL team's laughter grew louder with each miss. David Morrison, the range safety officer, watched from his station near the entrance. His weathered face and Marine Corps tattoo marked him as former military, someone who'd seen enough to recognize quality equipment when civilians used it. Chin's rifle setup bothered him in a way he couldn't quite name yet. Those modifications weren't standard sporting goods store purchases. Webb's voice cut through the range noise again, addressing his team, but meant for everyone to hear. "Man, if I shot like that, I'd take up knitting instead." His teammates responded with more laughter, the kind that invited others to join in mocking the outsider. Morrison approached Chin's lane, his steps deliberate. "Captain," he said quietly, "you need a moment?" The ranks slipped out automatically, recognition of something he'd noticed but couldn't yet place. Chin shook her head without looking at him. "Just working through it," she replied, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. She fired again. Another miss, this one worse than the others. 8 missed shots now, each one feeding the commentary from lane 5. Webb stood and stretched, making a show of walking toward Morrison's station. "Hey, range officer," he called out. "Maybe get someone qualified on that lane? She's wasting everyone's time and ammunition." His grin suggested he thought himself charming rather than cruel. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'd recommend you focus on your own shooting," he said, his tone professional but cold. He'd dealt with hotshot SEALs before, men who thought their trident made them superior to everyone who'd worn a different uniform or none at all. Chun fired 3 more times in quick succession. Miss, miss, miss. 11 total now. Her hands trembled visibly, the medication winning its daily battle against her muscle memory and training. She lowered the rifle and stood, her decision made quickly. Without a word to Morrison or acknowledgement of the SEALs, Chun walked to her car. Webb watched her go, his smirk suggesting victory in a competition she hadn't known she'd entered. His team had already returned to their own shooting, the entertainment over. From his station, Morrison observed Chun through the office window. She sat in her driver's seat, holding a pill bottle up to read the label in the sunlight. He couldn't make out the name from this distance, but he recognized the moment of decision playing out across her face. She tapped out a pill, looked at it, then broke it in half before swallowing one piece and returning the other to the bottle. Morrison had seen that choice before, years ago, in Friends Who'd Come Home Changed. The calculation between managing symptoms and maintaining performance. The sacrifice of comfort for capability. Chin sat there for 15 minutes, waiting for the reduced dosage to take effect, her hands gradually steadying as the tremor-inducing medication left her system. When she walked back into the facility, her stride had changed. More purposeful. Morrison noticed Webb notice her return, saw the SEAL lieutenant's smirk reappear as he said something to his team that triggered another round of laughter. Chin took her position at lane 7, loaded a fresh magazine, and began her breathing routine again. This time, her hands remained steady as she raised a rifle and acquired her target. The reduced medication dosage worked its way through Chin's system as she settled into her shooting stance. Her breathing fell into the rhythm she'd learned years ago, back when instructors had recognized something special in her ability to slow her heart rate under pressure. The tremors that had plagued her first 11 shots faded, replaced by the steady control that had kept 4 Rangers alive during 6 hours of hell in Afghanistan. She fired. The round punched through paper 200 yards downrange, dead center mass. No celebración, no acknowledgement. Just the mechanical process of acquiring the next target, controlling her breath, and squeezing the trigger with the same pressure every time. 9 more shots followed in smooth succession. Each one struck within a 3-inch grouping at the heart of her target. Morrison watched the pattern develop on his monitor, his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Civilian recreational shooters didn't maintain that kind of consistency, especially not after missing their first 11 attempts. At lane 5, Kowalski lowered his rifle and tapped Webb's shoulder. "Hey, LT," he said, gesturing toward the monitor displaying Chin's target feed. "Check out lane 7. Webb glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from amusement to something more guarded. The tight grouping was impossible to dismiss as luck. Torres leaned in to look, his eyebrows rising as he studied the shot placement. "That's not normal," he muttered, more to himself than his teammates. Chun continued shooting as if the SEAL team didn't exist. Morrison made a decision and approached her lane during a reload pause. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm moving your target to 300 yards. She nodded once. No words necessary between people who understood the language of marksmanship. The target frame rolled back automatically, doubling the distance. Webb's team had stopped their own shooting entirely now, watching lane 7 with the kind of attention they usually reserved for evaluating other SEALs. Martinez crossed his arms, his earlier smirk replaced by focused observation. Chun adjusted her scope with practiced efficiency, compensating for the increased range and the subtle crosswind that had picked up in the last 10 minutes. Her first shot at 300 yards took longer to set up, the calculations running through her mind automatically after years of making them under circumstances far worse than a sunny California morning. The round struck center mass. The 9 that followed created a grouping only slightly larger than her 200-yard pattern. Morrison pulled up his tablet and made notes in the range log, his entries more detailed than usual. He'd started to suspect who she might be, but wanted confirmation before he acted on the hunch forming in his mind. Webb holstered his own weapon and walked toward Chin's lane, his confidence intact despite what he'd witnessed. The range protocol required shooters to maintain lane boundaries during active shooting, but Webb had never been particularly concerned with civilian range rules. Morrison moved to intercept him, positioning himself between the SEAL and Chin's position. "Lieutenant," Morrison said firmly, "please maintain lane boundaries." His tone carried the authority of someone who'd once held rank himself and hadn't entirely let it go. Webb ignored the instruction, his focus on Chun. "Nice grouping," he said, loud enough to carry over the ear protection. "You take lessons somewhere?" The question carried an edge, suggesting that her skill must have an external source rather than being inherent. Chun continued her reload process without responding. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when words rarely changed minds that had already decided who deserved respect. The rifle magazine clicked into place with mechanical precision. Webb pressed forward, his competitive nature overriding whatever caution his training should have provided. "My boys and I have a bet running," he continued. 1,000 yards, 10 shots. You game? The challenge hung in the air between them, wrapped in the false friendliness of someone who expected to win. Chun paused, then turned to face him directly for the first time since the SEALs had arrived. Her expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away. "I don't shoot for sport," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry. "Because you can't," Webb replied, his grin widening, "or because you're scared." The taunt was designed to provoke, the kind of challenge that worked on ego-driven shooters who needed to prove themselves. Behind him, his team watched the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort. Torres looked away, suddenly interested in his own equipment. Morrison stepped between them fully now, his patience exhausted. "Lieutenant Webb, that's enough," he said, his Marine Corps authority bleeding through the civilian job title. "This is inappropriate, and you know it." Webb held up his hands in mock surrender. "It's just a friendly challenge. Officer," he said, his tone suggesting Morrison was overreacting. "Unless the lady needs special accommodations." The phrase dripped with condescension, implying weakness where none existed. Chun stood and turned to face Webb completely. As she moved, her jacket shifted slightly, revealing the interior of her tactical vest. 3 purple heart pins caught the morning light, their distinctive purple and gold unmistakable to anyone with military knowledge. Morrison saw them immediately, his breath catching as the final piece of his suspicion clicked into place. Webb's attention remained on Chen's face, missing the medals entirely. His confidence hadn't wavered, still certain he understood exactly who he was dealing with and what the outcome of any challenge would be. Chen studied him for a long moment, measuring something Morrison couldn't quite identify. "One condition," she finally said. "You miss even once, you leave." Her terms were simple, direct, and non-negotiable. Webb's grin spread wider. "Deal," he replied immediately. "And you miss, you admit you're out of your league." He extended his hand as if to shake on the agreement, the gesture more theatrical than genuine. Chen didn't take his hand. She simply nodded once and began packing her current setup, preparing for the 1,000-yard challenge that Webb had no idea he'd already lost. Morrison set up the 1,000-yard lane with deliberate precision, his hands steadier than they'd been in months. The distant target frames rolled into position on mechanical rails, small white squares against the brown hillside that most recreational shooters never attempted. He'd run this range for 3 years and could count on one hand the number of civilians who'd requested this distance. Other shooters noticed the activity and drifted toward lanes 5 and 7, curious about the competition developing between the confident SEAL team and the quiet woman who'd started the morning missing everything she aimed at. Morrison caught fragments of their conversations, speculation about whether this was some kind of exhibition or formal challenge. While Chun and Webb prepared their rifles, Morrison pulled his tablet from his equipment vest and opened a range management system. Every shooter who signed in provided basic information, but range officers with his clearance level could access additional databases for security purposes. He typed Chen's name from the sign-in sheet into the military personnel registry. The results populated slowly, security clearances verifying his access rights before displaying classified information. Captain Sarah Chun, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. Current status: medical leave, PTSD, treatment program. Morrison's eyes moved down the screen, taking in details that explained everything he'd witnessed. Combat médic spécialiste. 3 deployments, Afghanistan, 2018 through 2021. The commendations section made his throat tighten. Silver Star for Valor. Bronze Star with WWII. 3 Purple Hearts, each one representing a moment when she'd been wounded badly enough to warrant documentation, but not badly enough to stop fighting. He tapped the Silver Star citation, and the full text appeared. Captain Sarah Chun, while serving as senior medic and designated marksman with 75th Ranger Regiment during Operation Enduring Freedom, distinguished herself through extraordinary heroism. When her patrol came under sustained enemy fire from fortified positions, Captain Chun maintained defensive overwatch while simultaneously treating for critically wounded Rangers. Over 6 hours of continuous engagement, she eliminated 23 hostile combatants at ranges exceeding 800 meters while managing life-threatening injuries to her teammates. Despite suffering serious wounds herself, Captain Chun refused evacuation until a relief convoy secured her position. Her actions directly saved 4 American lives under the most demanding combat conditions. Morrison read the citation twice, his mind filling in the details the formal language glossed over. 6 hours of being shot at while keeping 4 men alive and killing anyone who tried to finish them off. He looked up from the tablet toward Chun, who was making final adjustments to her rifle as calmly as if she were preparing for an afternoon at a coffee shop. Webb finished his setup first, his rifle a standard SLIM 110 with quality optics, but nothing exotic. He took his position at the firing line with the easy confidence of someone who trained at this distance hundreds of times. Morrison noted the small crowd that had gathered, at least a dozen people now, several holding up phones to record whatever happened next. The SEAL's first shot broke the morning stillness. Webb worked through his 10-round magazine with practiced efficiency, each shot followed by a brief pause for adjustment before the next. When he finished, Morrison checked the target monitor and announced the results. 9 center mass, 1 outer ring, he called out. Solid performance by any standard, the kind of shooting that won competitions and impressed observers. Webb's team offered congratulations with backslaps and fist bumps. Kowalski whistled low, acknowledging his lieutenant's skill. Torres grinned, already celebrating a victory that seemed assured. Even Martinez, who'd appeared uncomfortable with the morning's events, nodded approvingly at the target display. Chun stepped to the line without fanfare. She didn't check the wind flags that dotted the range or consult any data cards. Morrison recognized the behavior of someone who'd done these calculations so many times that the math ran automatically, muscle memory and experience converging into instinct. Her first shot came after 30 seconds of absolute stillness. The sound was clean, professional, unremarkable except for how smoothly it integrated into her breathing cycle. On the monitor, a small hole appeared in the exact center of the target's ring, the innermost circle that defined perfect accuracy. The second shot followed 20 seconds later. Another's ring strike, this one less than an inch from the first. Chen's rhythm never varied, each shot separated by the same interval, the same breathing pattern, the same microscopic adjustments between rounds. By her 5th shot, the crowd had gone completely silent. The tight grouping developing on the target monitor defied what most of them understood about long-range shooting. Wind, temperature, even the Earth's rotation affected bullets at 1,000 yards, introducing variables that made perfect consistency nearly impossible. Chen fired her 6th shot. Zring. Her 7th. Zring. The pattern held with mechanical regularity that suggested either impossible luck or skill so far beyond the normal range that it redefined what the observers thought possible. Webb's expression had shifted from confident to focused, then from focused to concerned. He stared at the monitor as Chen's 8th and 9th shots joined their predecessors in a grouping the size of a softball. At 1,000 yards, that level of consistency belonged in record books or military after-action reports, not civilian shooting ranges on Saturday mornings. Chen's 10th and final shot struck the same impossibly tight cluster. Morrison checked the measurements on his system and felt his assessment confirmed. 10 for 10 in his ring, total group diameter of 4.3 inches at 1,000 yards. He'd been running this range long enough to know he'd just witnessed something that happened maybe once a year, if that, and never from someone who'd started the day missing 11 consecutive shots. The crowd remained quiet for a moment, then scattered applause broke out. Several phones were definitely recording now, capturing both the target display and Chen's calm expression as she cleared her rifle and began breaking down her equipment. Webb stood motionless at his lane, staring at the comparison between his target and hers on the monitor. 9 center mass and 1 flyer suddenly looked ordinary next to Chen's performance. His teammates had gone quiet, the earlier celebration evaporating into uncomfortable awareness. Morrison approached Webb with his tablet. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you need to see something." The range officer's expression carried weight that made Webb finally look away from the monitor. Webb's eyes tracked from a monitor to Morrison's tablet, irritation flashing across his features before he registered the range officer's serious expression. "She got lucky," Webb said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Wind conditions changed between our shots." The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Morrison held the tablet screen toward Webb without speaking. The military personnel database display showed Chen's photograph in dress uniform, her face younger but unmistakably the same woman currently packing her rifle at Lane 7. Webb's gaze moved to the text below the photo, and Morrison watched the color drain from the SEAL's face as he read. 75th Ranger Regiment, Webb said quietly, the words almost a question despite the clear text in front of him. His eyes continued scanning downward, hitting each commendation like a physical blow. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 3 Purple Hearts. Torres had moved close enough to read over Webb's shoulder, and his sharp intake of breath drew Kowalski and Martinez closer. "Holy shit, LT," Torres breathed, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "She's a Ranger." Morrison scrolled down to the Silver Star citation and turned the tablet so all 4 SEALs could read it simultaneously. The formal military language detailed 6 hours under sustained enemy fire, 23 confirmed kills while treating 4 wounded Rangers, continued fighting despite her own serious injuries. The words painted a picture that contradicted everything they'd assumed about the quiet woman they'd mocked for the past 2 hours. Martinez spoke first among the team, his voice barely above a whisper. "We fucked up." The simple statement carried the weight of recognition, understanding that they'd misjudged not just her skill, but her entire existence in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. Chen secured her rifle in its case with methodical care, each movement precise and unhurried. She'd been aware of the crowd watching her shoot, the phones recording, the shift in atmosphere as her performance dismantled assumptions. None of it mattered particularly. She'd learned years ago that proving herself to strangers was a temporary satisfaction that never quite filled the space it was supposed to occupy. Webb handed the tablet back to Morrison and walked toward Chen's lane, his swagger replaced by something more careful. His team followed at a distance, their earlier camaraderie subdued into uncomfortable silence. "Ma'am," Webb started, then stopped, seeming to search for words that might adequately address the situation. "We didn't know," he finally managed. Chun paused in her packing and turned to face him fully. The question she asked was simple, delivered without anger or accusation, just genuine curiosity. "Would it have mattered if you did?" The words hung between them, challenging not just Webb, but the entire assumption underlying the morning's events. Webb opened his mouth, then closed it. His training had prepared him for many difficult conversations, but not for this particular question from this particular person. Behind him, Torres looked away, suddenly fascinated by his own boots. Kowalski's jaw worked silently, processing implications he hadn't considered until this moment. She didn't wait for an answer. She lifted her rifle case and turned toward the exit, her movements suggesting the conversation was complete whether Webb had found words or not. Morrison stepped aside to let her pass, and she acknowledged him with a slight nod that carried more communication than most people managed with full sentences. Webb stood frozen in place, watching her walk toward the parking lot. The crowd that had gathered began dispersing now that the show was clearly over, several people still looking at their phones, presumably reviewing video they'd captured. Morrison could already imagine those videos spreading through social media, military forums, shooting communities. The range officer had seen enough viral moments to recognize this one forming in real time. Captain Chun, Morrison called after her, his voice carrying the respect of her rank, even in this civilian context. "A moment, please." She stopped but didn't turn fully, her body language suggesting patience rather than interest. Morrison approached carefully, aware of Webb and his team watching the interaction. "I wanted to say," he started, then reconsidered his approach. "Thank you for your service." The phrase was standard, often meaningless through overuse, but Morrison meant it with the depth of someone who'd worn the uniform himself and understood what those commendations represented. "And I apologize for what happened here this morning." Chen's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional demeanor since she'd arrived. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said simply. "You're on a good range." Then, after a pause, "Make sure they understand the terms of the bet." She gestured toward Webb without looking at him directly. Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "He misses even once. He leaves," he confirmed, reciting her condition from earlier. "He missed one." Chen nodded and continued toward her car. Webb heard the exchange and felt the final piece of the morning's humiliation settle into place. He'd lost the bet on its explicit terms, but that technical defeat was trivial compared to the larger loss of dignity and professional bearing. Morrison returned to Webb's position, his expression carrying none of the deference he'd shown Chun. "Lieutenant, you agree to terms," he said, his voice formal and cold. "You missed one shot. She wants you to honor the agreement." Webb's team shifted uncomfortably. They all understood what was being asked. Leaving the range meant public acknowledgement of the bet's outcome, visible admission that they'd been wrong in every assumption they'd made. It meant walking past the remaining shooters who'd witnessed the entire sequence, past the cars in the parking lot, carrying the weight of their misjudgment. Kowalski spoke quietly to Webb. "LT, we should go. It's the right call." The words carried more meaning than their surface suggested, acknowledging that leaving with some dignity intact was better than the alternatives. Webb nodded slowly, the motion heavy with reluctant acceptance. He began gathering his equipment with none of the casual confidence he displayed while unpacking it. His team followed suit, their movements subdued and efficient. The earlier jokes and laughter seemed to belong to a different group of men from a different morning. As they packed their truck, Martinez glanced toward Chen's car. She sat in the driver's seat, not leaving yet, just sitting quietly with her hands on the steering wheel. He wondered what she was thinking, whether this morning had been victory or simply exhausting necessity, whether proving herself to strangers who should have known better brought any satisfaction at all, or just reinforced how often she'd have to keep doing it. Webb started the truck's engine. The drive back to base would be quiet, he knew, filled with the kind of silence that came from recognizing a failure that couldn't be fixed with more training or better equipment. They pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. Commander James Hartley arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters Monday morning to find his inbox flooded with messages marked urgent. The first email came from Morrison at Pacific Coast Range, timestamped Saturday evening with the subject line, "Conduct Incident Requiring Command Attention." Hartley opened it while his coffee was still cooling, expecting the usual weekend drama involving alcohol or civilian complaint about noise. The email contained 3 video file links, a formal incident report, and an attachment showing Captain Sarachin's military service record. Hartley read Morrison's summary first, his jaw tightening as the range officer described the morning's events in careful detail. SEAL team led by Lieutenant Marcus Webb engaged in sustained mockery of female civilian shooter, later identified as decorated Army Ranger veteran. Incident captured on multiple phones by witnesses. Recommend immediate command review. Hartley clicked the first video link. The phone footage was shaky but clear enough, showing Chun at her lane missing shots while male voices laughed in the background. He recognized Webb's voice offering to teach the lady how it's done, the condescension unmistakable even through the phone's small speaker. The second video showed the challenge, Webb's cocky grin as he laid out the terms, his team's visible confidence that their lieutenant would dominate any civilian shooter. Hartley watched Chen's careful stillness as she agreed. The way she moved with economic precision that should have signaled military training to anyone paying attention. The third video captured the competition's conclusion. Hartley watched Chen's perfect grouping develop on the range monitor while the crowd grew silent, then saw the moment Webb learned who he'd been dismissing. The SEAL's face went pale in the video as he read Morrison's tablet, and Hartley could read his lieutenant's lips forming the words 75th Ranger Regiment. Hartley paused the video and opened Chen's service record. He'd never met her personally, but her reputation within special operations communities was well established. The Silver Star citation made him wince, imagining one of his own men in that 6-hour firefight, then imagining them mocking the person who'd fought it. He cross-referenced her name in the VA treatment database, his command clearance granting access to information that made the incident worse. Chen was currently enrolled in PTSD treatment at the San Diego VA hospital. Her file showed weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a psychologist Hartley knew by reputation. The treatment notes, heavily redacted for privacy, still contained enough information to paint a picture. Patients struggling with civilian reintegration, frequent experiences of discrimination when military service not visible. Shooting therapy prescribed as controlled exposure to manage trauma triggers. Hartley picked up his desk phone and dialed Morrison's number. The range officer answered on the second ring. "This is Commander Hartley, Naval Special Warfare Command," he said without preamble. "Tell me exactly what happened Saturday, every detail you remember." Morrison walked him through the full sequence, including details not in the written report. The way Chun had sat in her car, adjusting her medication, Morrison's recognition of someone choosing performance over symptom management. The SEAL team's escalating mockery. Chen's question to Webb after he learned her identity. "Would it have mattered if you did?" Hartley closed his eyes and pressed his thumb against his forehead. "So she reduced her PTSD medication to stop the tremors," he said slowly, making sure he understood correctly. "To prove herself to my men who assumed she was incompetent because she's a woman in civilian clothes." "That's exactly what happened, sir," Morrison confirmed. "And now she refuses to come back to the range. Her therapist called me yesterday. This was a major part of her treatment protocol, and it's gone." Hartley thanked Morrison and ended the call. He opened his computer's personnel management system and pulled Webb's complete file. Excellent combat record, multiple successful deployments, commendations for leadership under fire. But buried in the informal notes section were 2 previous complaints from other commands. 6 months ago, Webb had gotten into an argument with an Army logistics officer at a joint training exercise, dismissing the officer's input because he wasn't combat arms. A year before that, a civilian contractor had reported Webb's team making inappropriate comments about her qualifications during a base security upgrade. The pattern was clear to Hartley now, visible in retrospect, though apparently not addressed seriously before. Webb's team had developed a superiority complex that extended beyond healthy unit pride into actual disrespect for anyone outside their immediate circle. The SEAL community's reputation for excellence had curdled into arrogance, at least within this particular team. Hartley drafted an email to his administrative officer. "Schedule Lieutenant Webb and his complete team for my office, 1400 hours today, mandatory attendance." Copy the email to Webb directly, so there would be no confusion about its priority. His next call went to the Naval Special Warfare Group commander, Captain Thomas Richardson, his immediate superior. Hartley summarized the incident in professional terms, avoiding editorial commentary while making the facts clear. Richardson listened in silence until Hartley finished. "How bad is the social media exposure?" Richardson asked, cutting to the practical concern that would determine how much institutional attention this incident demanded. Hartley checked the video links again, seeing the view counts had climbed overnight. The original videos had been shared to multiple military forums, veteran groups, and social media platforms. Combined views exceeded 50,000, and the comment sections were uniformly critical of the SEAL team's behavior. "Going viral, sir," Hartley confirmed. Multiple military news outlets have already contacted public affairs requesting comment. Richardson was quiet for a moment. "Handle it at your level first," he finally said. "Written reprimands, mandatory training, and I want a plan for preventing similar incidents. If it escalates beyond that, we'll brief the Admiral together. And Hartley," he added, his tone shifting slightly, "make sure those men understand they embarrassed more than just themselves. They embarrassed the Trident and everyone who wears it." After ending the call, Hartley pulled up Webb's training schedule. The lieutenant was scheduled to teach a civilian military cooperation seminar next month, a prestigious assignment that involved working with local law enforcement and community leaders. Hartley made a note to reassign that duty. Webb had just demonstrated conclusively that he lacked the temperament for that particular responsibility. The morning had barely started, and Hartley already felt exhausted by the cleanup ahead. He'd seen good men make bad decisions before, but this incident combined arrogance, disrespect, and documented harm to a veteran's recovery in ways that demanded comprehensive response. The easy path would be written counseling and moving on. The right path required actually addressing the cultural problem that had allowed this incident to develop in the first place. Webb sat in the SEAL Team ready room Monday morning, his coffee untouched as he stared at Commander Hartley's email on his phone. Mandatory attendance at 1400 hours. No explanation provided, but Webb didn't need one. The weekend's incident at the range had clearly reached command attention faster than he'd hoped it might dissipate into forgotten history. Torres entered the room and dropped into a chair across from Webb. "You see the email?" he asked, though his lieutenant's expression made the answer obvious. The younger SEAL had spent Sunday evening watching the videos spread across social media, reading comment after comment from other service members excoriating their behavior. His sister, an Army captain stationed in Germany, had sent him a link with a single word. "Really?" Kowalski and Martinez arrived together, their usual pre-training banter absent. The four men who'd started Saturday morning confident and comfortable now sat in heavy silence, each processing their individual responsibility for the collective failure. Martinez had tried calling his father, a retired Marine sergeant major, to explain what happened. The old man had listened without interrupting, then said he was disappointed and hung up. Martinez hadn't slept well since. The day's scheduled training passed in mechanical routine. Room clearing drills, communications, exercises, equipment maintenance. Webb went through the motions while his mind ran through possible approaches to the afternoon's meeting. Apologize immediately and accept responsibility. Explain the context without making excuses. Acknowledge the failure and request guidance on making it right. Every option felt inadequate against the weight of what they'd done. At 1350 hours, the four SEALs stood outside Commander Hartley's office in dress uniforms, the formal attire making the meeting's seriousness unmistakable. Hartley's yeoman, a petty officer first class named Davidson, gestured them inside at precisely 1400. Military punctuality allowed no grace period for dreading what came next. Hartley sat behind his desk, his expression neutral in the way that experienced officers perfected when they were actively controlling anger. "Gentlemen," he said without preamble, "tell me what happened Saturday at Pacific Coast Shooting Range." His tone suggested he already knew every detail, but wanted to hear their version anyway. Webb began recounting the morning's events, trying to present facts without minimizing their actions. Hartley let him speak for maybe 30 seconds before holding up one hand. "Stop," the commander said flatly. "I have 3 videos and 6 witness statements, including a detailed report from the range safety officer. Try again, and this time leave out anything that sounds like justification." The air in the office felt heavy. Torres shifted his weight slightly, the only movement among the 4 men standing at attention. "Sir," he said quietly, "we were out of line. We made assumptions about a civilian shooter based on gender and her initial performance. Those assumptions were wrong, and our behavior was unprofessional." Hartley opened his laptop and turned it to face them. He played the first video without sound, just the images of Chun missing shots while the SEALs laughed. Then the second video, Webb's voice clear as he offered to teach the lady. Finally, the third video, Chin's perfect performance, and their visible shock at learning her identity. "That woman has 3 purple hearts," Hartley said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Does anyone here know what that means?" He looked at each seal individually, demanding engagement rather than passive reception of the lecture they knew was coming. 3 combat wounds, sir," Martinez answered. 3 times wounded seriously enough to warrant documentation. Hartley pulled up Chin's Silver Star citation on his screen and read it aloud, his voice steady as he detailed the 6-hour firefight, the 23 confirmed kills, the 4 Rangers kept alive while Chin fought through her own injuries. When he finished, the silence in the office was absolute. "She's been attending that range as PTSD therapy," Hartley continued, sliding a printed document across his desk. "Past tense, because after Saturday, she refuses to go back. This is from her treating psychologist at the VA. The therapy setback from your behavior is measured in months of recovery progress lost." Webb felt sick. The abstract knowledge that they'd misjudged someone became concrete in the face of documented harm to her treatment. Torres's jaw clenched, muscles visible beneath his skin. Kowalski stared at the document without reaching for it, as if touching it would make the consequences more real. Hartley wasn't finished. He pulled up additional records on his screen. "She reduced her PTSD medication to stop her hands from shaking," he said, looking directly at Webb. "She chose to compromise her symptom management so she could perform well enough to prove herself to you. Think about that decision. Think about what it means that she felt she had to make it." "Jesus, sir," Torres breathed, the words escaping before he could stop them. Hartley leaned back in his chair. "Here's what happens now," he said, his tone shifting from disappointed to administrative. "Written apologies from each of you, formal and detailed. Not sorry we offended you, but genuine acknowledgement of what you did wrong and the harm it caused. Mandatory respect and conduct training, scheduled for next week. And Lieutenant Webb, you're removed from the Civilian Military Cooperation Seminar next month. Someone who just demonstrated he can't treat civilians with basic respect doesn't get to represent this command in community outreach." Webb absorbed the consequences without reaction. They were fair, possibly even lenient given the circumstances. "Yes, sir," he said simply. But Hartley wasn't finished detailing the response. "I'm also implementing new training requirements across all teams under my command," he continued. "Civilian-military relations, invisible service members, PTSD awareness. Your incident exposed a cultural problem that extends beyond your team. We're going to fix it systematically." The commander stood, signaling the formal portion of the meeting was ending. "The written apologies are due by Friday," he said. "Dismissed." The 4 SEALs saluted and turned to leave. "Lieutenant Webb," Hartley called out before they reached the door. Webb turned back. "Sir?" Hartley's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained hard. "You're a good SEAL with a solid combat record," he said. "But excellence in combat doesn't excuse failure in character. Figure out which matters more to you, because right now your team respects the Trident more than they respect the people who earn other medals. That needs to change." Webb nodded, the weight of his commander's assessment settling over him. "Understood, sir." He left the office knowing that written apologies and mandatory training were the minimum response to what they'd broken. The harder work would be actually changing the mindset that had made Saturday morning possible in the first place. Chun sat at her kitchen table Tuesday morning, staring at the certified letter from Naval Special Warfare Command without opening it. The return address told her enough about the contents. She'd known the incident would generate official responses once Morrison filed his report and the videos spread beyond local shooting forums to broader military communities. What she didn't know was whether she wanted to read whatever formal apologies the Navy had compelled from Webb's team. The coffee in her mug had gone cold while she considered the envelope. Dr. Reynolds had called yesterday to schedule an emergency session after Chun canceled her regular therapy appointment. The psychologist's concern was warranted. Chun hadn't left her house since Saturday except to buy groceries, and even that brief excursion to the store had triggered anxiety she thought she'd managed months ago. She finally opened the envelope and found 5 separate letters, each on official Navy letterhead with different signatures. Webb's letter was first, his handwriting precise and controlled in a way that suggested multiple drafts. Captain Chun, I have no excuse for my behavior at Pacific Coast Range. My arrogance blinded me to your service and sacrifice. I dishonored both you and my own uniform through assumptions based on nothing but my own inflated sense of superiority. You deserved respect regardless of your military record, and I failed to provide even basic courtesy. I am sorry for the harm my actions caused to your recovery and well-being. The other 4 letters followed similar patterns, each seal acknowledging their specific failures in different words. Torres wrote about learning from his sister's experiences as a female officer, recognizing how often women in service faced exactly the kind of dismissal he'd participated in. Martinez mentioned his father's disappointment, using it as context for understanding the weight of betraying the values they claimed to represent. Kowalski's letter was shortest but perhaps most direct, stating simply that he'd been wrong, knew it, and would work to ensure he never made similar judgments again. Chen read all 5 letters twice, then set them aside and picked up her phone. Dr. Reynolds answered on the first ring, her voice carrying professional warmth that Chun had learned to trust over 6 months of difficult therapy sessions. I got the apologies, Chen said without greeting. 5 letters, all formally written, all saying the right things. How do you feel about that? Reynolds asked, the classic therapist question that Chun would normally find irritating but had learned actually mattered in processing complex reactions. Chen considered the question honestly. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me appreciates the effort. They didn't have to write personal letters beyond whatever their commander required. But another part thinks paper doesn't change what happened. Words don't undo the damage. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, giving Chun space to continue if she wanted. Does anything undo it? The psychologist finally asked. Or is this about finding a way forward despite what happened? The question hit harder than Chen expected. She'd spent 2 days cycling through anger, disappointment, and exhaustion, searching for some resolution that would make Saturday feel less like a setback and more like a survivable incident. Nothing she tried had worked, leaving her stuck in the same mental loop that had defined her first months after returning from Afghanistan. They want me to accept their apologies, Chun said, the words coming out more bitter than she intended. They want to say it's okay, we're good, everyone learn a lesson and move forward. But I'm the one who can't go back to the range now. I'm the one whose treatment is set back months. They get to write letters and attend training and feel like they fixed it, while I'm still dealing with the actual consequences. Reynolds let the statement stand without immediate response, a technique Chen recognized as creating space for her to hear her own words and process them. You're right that the consequences aren't equal, the psychologist said eventually. They harmed you, and you're carrying the weight of that harm while they go through official remediation. That's not fair. So what do I do? Chen asked, genuine frustration breaking through her usual controlled demeanor. Do I accept the apologies to help myself move on, even though accepting them feels like letting them off the hook? Do I refuse them and stay angry, which only hurts me more? There's no good option here. What if accepting their apology isn't about them at all? Reynolds suggested. What if it's about you choosing not to let their failure define your recovery? You can acknowledge they were wrong, accept that they're attempting to make amends, and still maintain that what they did was harmful and unacceptable. Chen walked to her window, looking out at the small garden she'd been cultivating as part of her healing process. The tomatoes needed watering, she noticed absently. I don't need their validation, she said quietly. I never did. That's what made Saturday so frustrating. I already knew who I was and what I'd done. Their opinion shouldn't have mattered. But it did matter, Reynolds said gently, because you deserve basic respect regardless of your service record. You were right to ask Webb whether it would have mattered if they'd known. That question gets to the heart of the problem. You shouldn't have to prove yourself to be treated with dignity. Chun felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The letters sat on her kitchen table, formal apologies from men who'd learned a lesson at her expense. She could throw them away, file them, or respond to them. Each option carried different meanings and different weights. She made a decision. "I'm going to write back," she told Reynolds. "Not to forgive them or make them feel better, but to tell them what they actually need to understand. That respect can't be conditional on knowing someone's background. That invisible service members exist everywhere, and judgment based on assumptions causes real harm." Reynolds' approval was evident in her tone. "That sounds like taking control of the narrative," she said, making sure they don't get to decide what lesson they learned from this. After ending the call, Chun sat down and pulled out paper. Her response would be brief, direct, and uncompromising. She would make it easy for them to feel absolved, but she also wouldn't let their failure keep her trapped in anger that only damaged her own recovery. The distinction mattered more than she'd initially realized. Webb sat in his apartment that evening, attempting to write a personal letter beyond the official apology he'd already submitted. 3 versions had been drafted and deleted, each one feeling inadequate against the magnitude of what he needed to communicate. How did you apologize for fundamental disrespect that revealed character flaws rather than simple mistakes? He'd spent the day researching Chen's unit history, finding newspaper articles and military publications that detailed the 75th Ranger Regiment's operations during her deployment years. One article included a photograph of Chun receiving her Silver Star, and Webb had stared at the visible burn scars on her arms, evidence of injuries the citation had mentioned but not detailed. The article quoted one of the Rangers she'd saved. "Captain Chun told us to stay down, then she just handled it. 6 hours of the worst fighting I've ever seen, and she never stopped. Not when she got hit, not when we ran low on ammunition, not when it seemed like we wouldn't make it. I'm alive because she refused to accept any other outcome." Webb closed his laptop, unable to continue reading testimony that made his Saturday morning behavior feel worse with each survivor's account. He attempted the letter again, this time focusing on what he needed to say rather than what might make him feel better about having said it. The words came slowly, inadequately, but he forced himself to continue. Commander Hartley spent Wednesday morning implementing the policy changes he'd outlined to Webb's team. The incident at Pacific Coast Range had exposed cultural problems that extended beyond 5 SEALs, making bad judgments on a Saturday morning. His conversations with other commanders over the past 2 days had revealed similar incidents buried in informal complaints and dismissed as personality conflicts rather than addressed as institutional failures. Master Chief Ramos entered Hartley's office carrying a folder thick with documentation. "Sir, you asked for previous complaints involving respect issues across the teams," he said, setting the folder on the commander's desk. "What I found goes back 3 years and involves more people than I expected." Hartley opened the folder and began reading. The complaints followed patterns that became obvious once someone actually looked for them. SEALs dismissing Army personnel at joint training exercises. Condescending comments to civilian contractors providing technical support. Bar confrontations with other service members who didn't meet some undefined standard of worthiness. None of the incidents had been serious enough individually to warrant formal action, but the accumulated pattern painted a clear picture of superiority complex that had calcified into accepted culture. How many of these were actually addressed? Hartley asked, already knowing the answer from the thin documentation attached to each complaint. "Ramos grimaced. Most got handled informally, sir. Pull the guy aside, tell him to knock it off, move on." A few resulted in counseling statements that went in files and got forgotten. None led to systemic changes or recognition that we had a cultural problem. Hartley closed the folder and pulled up his computer. Naval Special Warfare Group Commander Richardson had approved his proposal for mandatory training across all West Coast SEAL teams. The curriculum would cover civilian-military relations, invisible service members, PTSD awareness, and the particular challenges faced by women in military service. Morrison had agreed to serve as one of the guest speakers, his experience as both a range officer and former Marine giving him credibility with the SEAL community. The training schedule was aggressive. All teams under Hartley's command would complete the program within 6 weeks, with additional annual refresher requirements built into the permanent training cycle. He'd also added mandatory volunteer hours at veteran support organizations, 20 hours annually for every SEAL, designed to expose them to the diversity of service experiences beyond special operations. His phone rang with a call from the Naval Special Warfare Public Affairs Officer. "Commander, we have a developing media situation," Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell said, without preamble. 3 news outlets have requested official comment on the Pacific Coast Range incident. The videos have over 200,000 combined views now, and the story is spreading beyond military communities into mainstream coverage. Hartley had anticipated this escalation. "What's our statement?" he asked, knowing that silence would be interpreted as institutional indifference. Mitchell read from her prepared response. "Naval Special Warfare Command takes all conduct incidents seriously. We are addressing this matter through appropriate leadership channels and implementing training to ensure all personnel understand the importance of treating every person with respect regardless of their background. We cannot comment on specific disciplinary actions, but affirm our commitment to fostering a culture of professionalism and dignity." The statement was carefully crafted to acknowledge the problem without providing details that might violate privacy or prejudice any ongoing actions. Hartley approved it with minor modifications, adding language about systemic policy changes to demonstrate institutional commitment beyond addressing individual behavior. After Mitchell ended the call, Hartley drafted an email to all personnel under his command. The message outlined the new training requirements, explained the reasoning behind them using general terms that didn't identify specific incidents, and made clear that cultural change was not optional. "Excellence in combat must be matched by excellence in character," he wrote, borrowing the phrase he'd used with Webb. "We represent more than our individual capabilities. We represent the values of service, sacrifice, and respect that define military professionalism." His administrative officer knocked and entered with another update. "Sir, the first mandatory respect training is scheduled for Monday. We have Morrison confirmed as speaker, plus Dr. Patricia Reynolds from the VA, who's agreed to present on PTSD and veteran transition challenges. The sessions will run full day, with all team members required to attend." Hartley nodded approval. "Make sure every team knows attendance is mandatory, and this isn't checking a box. I want active participation, questions, real engagement with the material. Anyone who shows up planning to coast through the day gets counseled immediately." The officer made notes and departed, leaving Hartley alone with the weight of institutional change. He'd been in command long enough to know that policy changes were easier than culture changes. He could mandate training, require volunteer hours, and counsel individuals who failed to meet standards. But actually shifting the mindset that allowed incidents like Saturdays required sustained effort over months and years, not weeks. His email notification chimed with a message from Richardson. The group commander had forwarded media coverage from a military news website. The article detailed the Pacific Coast Range incident using publicly available information from the viral videos, included quotes from other veterans who'd experienced similar dismissal, and raised questions about whether special operations culture had become too insular and arrogant. The article quoted an anonymous Army Ranger. "SEALs act like they're the only ones who've seen combat. I've watched them dismiss Purple Heart recipients, Silver Star winners, people who've done more with less in worse conditions. The trident doesn't make you superior to everyone else who served." Hartley read the article twice, recognizing uncomfortable truth in the criticism. The SEAL community's justified pride in their capabilities had sometimes crossed into dismissiveness toward other forms of service. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to create reputation problems that this incident had brought into sharp focus. Richardson's email included a brief note. "This is bigger than one team's bad morning. Fix it comprehensively, or we'll be dealing with similar incidents for years." The group commander's mandate was clear. Hartley's response needed to demonstrate genuine institutional change rather than performative damage control. He pulled up the training curriculum again and began adding elements. Role-playing scenarios where SEALs would experience dismissive treatment themselves. Case studies of decorated veterans from other services and branches. Statistics on veteran demographics showing that the vast majority of service members never served in special operations, but still sacrificed significantly. Guest speakers from diverse military backgrounds, not just conventional forces, but also support roles, medical personnel, logistics specialists who enabled combat operations without receiving the same recognition. The curriculum was becoming more comprehensive than he'd initially planned, but Hartley recognized that superficial training would generate superficial results. If he was going to ask his command to examine their attitudes and assumptions, he needed to provide thorough education that went beyond surface-level awareness. Master Chief Ramos returned with another update. "Sir, I've been talking with the senior enlisted across the teams. There's some resistance to the new requirements, concerns about training time taking away from operational preparation. But there's also recognition that we've had this coming. The chiefs know we've let problems slide too long." Hartley appreciated the honest assessment. "The resistance doesn't surprise me," he said. "Change is uncomfortable, especially when it requires admitting we've been wrong about something. But operational excellence means nothing if we can't function respectfully in garrison. Make sure the chiefs understand this comes from the top and isn't negotiable." Ramos nodded and left to continue his informal leadership conversations. Hartley returned to his policy drafts, knowing that the hardest work still lay ahead. Implementing training was straightforward. Actually changing hearts and minds required sustained commitment that would test his command's willingness to accept uncomfortable truths about themselves. The mandatory respect training session began Monday morning at 0800 in Naval Special Warfare Command's main briefing room. Webb and his team sat in the third row among 60 other SEALs, the assembled group representing all teams under Commander Hartley's command. The atmosphere carried tension that came from men accustomed to being the instructors suddenly finding themselves as students in a course that questioned their fundamental assumptions. Hartley opened the session personally, his presence signaling the training's importance. "Over the past week, an incident occurred that exposed cultural problems within our command," he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room without amplification. "This training is our response, but more importantly, it's our commitment to being better than we've been. Excellence in combat requires excellence in character, and we've fallen short of that standard." He introduced Morrison first, and the former Marine approached the podium with the confident bearing of someone who'd earned the right to address this particular audience. The range officer's presentation opened with statistics that challenged comfortable assumptions. 18 million veterans currently live in the United States, he said, displaying numbers on the screen behind him. Of those, approximately 70% don't publicly identify as veterans in their daily lives. 30% deal with service-connected PTSD or other conditions that affect their civilian reintegration. Morrison clicked to his next slide, showing photographs of ordinary-looking people in civilian clothes. "Each of these individuals is a decorated combat veteran," he explained. "Purple hearts, bronze stars, silver stars. You wouldn't know it by looking at them because they don't wear their service on their sleeve. The question is, does that change how you treat them?" He walked the audience through the Pacific Coast Range incident without naming Chun or Webb's team, but everyone in the room knew exactly which event he was describing. "The important detail wasn't who was involved," Morrison said. "The important detail is that this happened at all. That trained military professionals made assumptions about someone's capabilities based on gender and appearance, then compounded those assumptions with mockery and disrespect." Webb felt eyes on him from other SEALs who'd heard the full story. He kept his gaze forward, accepting the discomfort as part of the prize for his failure. Torres sat rigid beside him, while Kowalski's jaw muscles worked silently. Martinez stared at his hands, processing Morrison's presentation through the lens of his father's disappointment. The range officer's presentation concluded with a challenge. "Before you dismiss someone as less capable or less worthy of respect," Morrison said, "consider what you don't know about their background. Consider that the person you're judging might have done things in service to this country that equal or exceed your own accomplishments. And recognize that even if they haven't, basic human dignity doesn't require a service record to be deserved." Dr. Patricia Reynolds took the podium next, her credentials as a VA psychologist displayed on the screen. Where Morrison had focused on external respect, Reynolds addressed internal struggles that made incidents like the range confrontation particularly damaging. PTSD affects approximately 20% of post-9/11 combat veterans, she began. That's 1 in 5 people who deployed coming home with invisible wounds that affect their daily functioning. She described Chen's treatment without naming her, explaining how shooting therapy worked as controlled exposure to help veterans manage trauma triggers. When someone with PTSD puts themselves in a triggering situation as part of their recovery, Reynolds explained, they're making an enormous act of courage. They're fighting their own biology and trauma responses to reclaim activities that used to bring them joy or purpose. The psychologist displayed a graph showing PTSD recovery timelines. Progress is measured in months and years, not days or weeks, she said. A single negative incident can set recovery back significantly, undoing months of difficult therapeutic work. When you mock someone struggling with performance, you might be watching them fight an invisible battle you know nothing about. Webb thought about Chun sitting in her car, breaking her medication pill in half to reduce tremors so she could shoot well enough to prove herself. The image haunted him more than any combat memory he carried. She'd sacrificed her symptom management because of his judgment, compromised her health to meet standards he'd imposed through mockery. Reynolds concluded with specific guidance. If you encounter someone struggling with performance in any context, she said, consider that struggle might reflect challenges you can't see. Offer support instead of derision. Ask if they need assistance instead of assuming incompetence. Remember that invisible disabilities are still disabilities, and invisible service is still service. The morning session broke for lunch, and the SEALs dispersed into smaller groups. Webb's team stayed together, finding an empty corner of the facility's dining area where they could process the training without others overhearing. Torres spoke first, his voice quiet. That psychologist basically described exactly what we did wrong. Every single point she made was a direct hit. Kowalski nodded slowly. The medication thing, he said, referring to Reynolds' explanation of how PTSD medications affected performance. Chen chose between managing her symptoms and shooting well. We forced her to make that choice. Martinez pushed food around his plate without eating. My dad called last night, he said. First time since I told him about the range. He said the training better actually change how we think, not just check a requirement box. Said he'd know if I learned anything by how I treat people going forward. Webb had been silent, absorbing the morning's presentations and measuring them against his own behavior patterns. The training wasn't telling him anything he shouldn't have already known. Basic respect, human dignity, recognition that assumptions caused harm. These were principles he'd been taught long before joining the Navy, let alone becoming a SEAL. The uncomfortable truth was that he'd known better and chosen arrogance anyway. The afternoon session focused on role-playing scenarios designed to generate empathy through experience. SEALs were paired up and given situations where they'd be on the receiving end of dismissive treatment. Webb found himself partnered with a petty officer from another team, acting out a scenario where a civilian instructor dismissed his military experience as irrelevant to the subject being taught. The exercise was uncomfortable in exactly the way it was designed to be. Webb felt anger rising as his partner delivered condescending remarks about military personnel not understanding complex civilian concepts. The artificial nature of the role play didn't diminish the genuine emotional response it triggered. When the scenario ended, the facilitator asked participants to describe their reactions. Webb raised his hand. I felt angry and dismissed, he said honestly, like my experience and capabilities were being erased because they didn't fit someone's preconception. He paused, then added, which is exactly what I did to Captain Chin at the range. The facilitator nodded acknowledgement. That awareness is the starting point, she said. Recognizing your own reaction to dismissive treatment helps you understand why such treatment causes harm when you direct it at others. The question becomes whether that awareness changes your future behavior. The day's training concluded with Commander Hartley returning to address the assembled SEALs. What you learned today isn't optional knowledge you can choose to apply, he said. This is now part of our operational standards. Treat everyone with respect regardless of their apparent background. Recognize that invisible service and invisible struggles are real. Understand that your reputation affects the entire SEAL community, and incidents like the one we're addressing damage that reputation for everyone. He made eye contact with various team members as he spoke. We're implementing permanent policy changes, ongoing training requirements, and mandatory community service hours. But policies only work if the people following them actually believe in the principles behind them. I need each of you to examine your own attitudes and decide whether you're living up to the standards we claim to represent. The training ended, and SEALs filed out of the briefing room with varied reactions. Some appeared genuinely affected by the day's content. Others seemed to view it as an obligation fulfilled. Webb knew that actual culture change would take time and sustained effort, but he also recognized that today had planted seeds that might grow into meaningful transformation if properly nurtured. Webb arrived at the San Diego Veterans Community Center Thursday evening for his first volunteer shift. The mandatory 20 hours stretched across several weeks. The center occupied a converted warehouse near the waterfront. Its exterior plain, but its interior warm with donated furniture and walls covered in military memorabilia spanning multiple conflicts and branches of service. A receptionist directed him to the classroom where basic firearms safety courses were held for veterans transitioning to civilian life. The instructor coordinating the program was a retired Army Sergeant First Class named Patricia Okonkwo, her efficiency and direct manner immediately marking her as someone who'd spent decades managing soldiers. "You're Lieutenant Webb from NSW Command," she said without preamble. Commander Hartley called to explain the volunteer requirement. "You'll be assisting with basic marksmanship instruction for veterans who want to maintain their shooting skills or learn for the first time." Webb nodded, accepting the assignment without comment. The mandatory nature of his presence wasn't something he felt entitled to explain or justify. Okonkwo seemed to understand anyway, her expression suggesting she'd dealt with service members working through consequences before and had little patience for excuses. The evening's class included 6 veterans ranging from early 20s to mid-60s. 2 were women, one a former Navy corpsman and the other an Air Force weather technician. 3 men had served in conventional Army units, and the 6th was a former Marine supply specialist. None had special operations backgrounds, and none looked particularly comfortable with the firearms laid out on the instruction table. Okonkwo introduced Webb without mentioning his SEAL background, simply identifying him as an experienced shooter volunteering to provide additional instruction. The omission was deliberate, Webb realized, preventing students from treating him differently based on credentials that weren't relevant to the evening's purpose. The oldest student was a man named Gerald Chun, no relation to Captain Chun, but the shared surname hit Webb with unexpected weight. Gerald had served in Vietnam with the Army's 1st Infantry Division and was attending the class because his hands had started shaking from his central tremor, making him question whether he could safely handle firearms anymore. The parallel to Captain Chin's medication-induced tremors wasn't lost on Webb. Okonkwo walked the class through basic safety protocols before moving to live fire exercises. Gerald approached the firing line with visible anxiety, his hands trembling as he attempted to load the magazine. Webb watched the older veteran struggle, seeing frustration build as simple mechanical actions became difficult. The first instinct that rose in Webb was impatience, the same reaction he'd had watching Captain Chun miss her initial shots. But the day's training was fresh enough that he recognized the impulse for what it was: judgment without understanding, assumption without empathy. He pushed the reaction down and approached Gerald with deliberate care. "Sir," Webb said quietly, "may I make a suggestion?" Gerald nodded, grateful for help but clearly embarrassed by his difficulty. Webb demonstrated a modified grip that reduced the fine motor control required for loading, then showed breathing techniques that helped manage the tremors through control focus. The adjustments worked partially enough for Gerald to load successfully and take his first shots. 3 rounds went wide, missing the target entirely. The older veteran's shoulders slumped with disappointment. Webb felt the weight of recognition, seeing Captain Chen's initial misses through new context. "You're fighting your body to do this," Webb said, keeping his voice low and supportive. "That takes more strength than shooting with steady hands." The words felt inadequate but genuine. Gerald looked at him with surprise, perhaps expecting criticism rather than acknowledgement of the struggle itself being an achievement. They worked together for 40 minutes, Webb adjusting his teaching approach to accommodate Gerald's specific challenges. Small modifications to stance, different breathing patterns, encouragement focused on effort rather than results. By the end of the session, Gerald had placed 3 shots within the target's outer rings. Not center mass, not competition-worthy, but measurable progress that brought visible relief to the older veteran. After the class ended, Gerald approached Webb while packing equipment. "Thank you for your patience," he said, his gratitude carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being dismissed rather than supported. "Most instructors get frustrated when I can't perform like younger shooters. You treated me like the challenge was worth addressing instead of a problem to tolerate." Webb felt the comment land with more impact than Gerald probably intended. "You served," he replied simply. "That deserves patience and respect, not frustration." The words echoed principles from Monday's training, but speaking them in this context made them feel more real than they had in the abstract classroom environment. Driving home later, Webb thought about the differences between his interactions with Gerald and with Captain Chen. Both had struggled with performance. Both had dealt with physical challenges affecting their shooting. But where he'd mocked Chen's difficulties, he'd supported Gerald's. The distinction bothered him because it revealed his capacity for both responses. He could choose empathy or judgment, support or derision, and Saturday morning he'd chosen poorly. His phone buzzed with a text from Torres. "How was the volunteer shift?" The question carried genuine interest rather than mockery. His teammate, taking the mandatory service seriously rather than treating it as punishment to endure. Webb typed his response carefully. "Educational. Helped a Vietnam vet work through tremor issues while shooting. Made me think about what we did at the range differently." He sent the message and set his phone down, uncertain whether that admission would resonate with Torres or sound like platitude. The reply came quickly. "Same. Did mine at the VA yesterday. Helped organize donated supplies for homeless vets. One guy had a Silver Star from Iraq. Living in his car because he can't hold down work with his PTSD. Really puts things in perspective." Webb recognized the shift happening within his team. The volunteer requirements weren't just checking boxes toward completing their mandated hours. The exposure to veterans struggling with challenges they'd never faced was generating the empathy that Monday's training had tried to teach through presentation and role play. Seeing real people dealing with real consequences made the abstract principles concrete. He spent the next hour researching the San Diego Veterans Community Center's programs, finding opportunities beyond his required 20 hours. The center ran a mentorship program matching combat veterans with younger service members transitioning to civilian life. They needed volunteers who understood military culture but could help bridge the gap to civilian professional environments. Webb submitted an application to the mentorship program, surprising himself with the decision. The mandatory service was 20 hours. What he was considering would require ongoing commitment over months, possibly years. But the work felt necessary in ways that extended beyond satisfying Commander Hartley's requirements or absolving his guilt about the range incident. His phone rang with a call from Kowalski. "Hey LT, you still up?" The casual question suggested this wasn't urgent business. "Yeah, what's going on?" Webb answered, hearing something in his teammate's voice that sounded like processing rather than simple checking in. Kowalski was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about that training Monday," he finally said, "about how we treated Captain Chun and what that says about us. Not just that morning, but the attitude that made that morning possible. I don't like what I'm seeing when I look at my own behavior patterns." Webb understood exactly what his teammate meant. The range incident hadn't been an isolated failure, but rather the visible manifestation of attitudes they'd cultivated over time. The superiority complex Morrison had identified, the dismissiveness toward anyone outside their immediate circle, the assumption that the trident elevated them above basic requirements of human decency. "I'm struggling with the same recognition," Webb admitted. "Today at the community center, I worked with a Vietnam vet who had trouble loading his weapon because of tremors. My first instinct was impatience, same reaction I had watching Captain Chin. But I caught it this time and chose differently. The fact that I had to consciously choose means the default setting is still wrong." "So what do we do?" Kowalski asked. "How do we actually change instead of just acknowledging we need to?" Webb didn't have a complete answer. "I think we start by continuing to catch ourselves when the old patterns emerge," he said slowly. "And we hold each other accountable when we slip. This can't be something we learn during mandatory training and forget as soon as we're back to normal operations." 3 weeks after the mandatory training, Commander Hartley reviewed preliminary assessment reports showing measurable changes in conduct across his command. Informal complaints about disrespectful behavior had dropped 60%, and feedback from joint training exercises with other military units indicated improved professional relationships. The numbers suggested progress, though Hartley remained cautious about declaring victory too early. Cultural change required sustained commitment over months and years, not temporary improvement driven by fresh scrutiny. Master Chief Ramos entered with additional updates. "Sir, the volunteer programs are showing interesting patterns," he said, referencing data from the various veteran support organizations where SEALs were completing their mandatory hours. Several team members have exceeded their required 20 hours significantly. Webb's logged 45 hours at the Veterans Community Center and applied for their mentorship program. Hartley raised an eyebrow at that detail. Webb specifically requested ongoing mentorship responsibility. The question carried weight because mentorship required extended personal commitment rather than simply fulfilling obligation and moving on. Holmes nodded. He's working with 3 younger veterans transitioning to civilian careers, meeting with them weekly, helping with job applications, providing references. The center coordinator says he's taken it seriously and the men are responding well. Torres is doing similar work at the VA hospital. Martinez volunteers at a homeless veteran outreach program, and Kowalski's teaching financial literacy classes for transitioning service members. The pattern suggested genuine engagement rather than minimal compliance. Hartley made notes about recognizing the additional effort appropriately, though he remained aware that one team's improvement didn't necessarily reflect broader cultural change. Other teams under his command were completing their requirements with varying levels of enthusiasm and actual learning. His phone rang with a call from Captain Richardson, the group commander. "Hartley, I'm getting positive feedback about your training initiative," Richardson said. "Other NSW commands are asking for curriculum details to implement similar programs. The Admiral wants a brief on scalability and potential for expanding this across the entire SEAL community." Hartley felt satisfaction at the recognition, but also concern about rushing expansion before fully understanding what worked and what needed adjustment. "Sir, I'd recommend we complete the full cycle with my command first," he responded carefully. 6 weeks of implementation isn't enough data to declare success. Let's measure results over 6 months before scaling this across other commands. Richardson considered that recommendation. "Fair point. Write up your lessons learned so far and preliminary results. We'll use that to develop the broader rollout plan while your command serves as the pilot program." And Hartley, he added, "Good work on this. You took an ugly incident and turned it into institutional improvement." After ending the call, Hartley pulled up his calendar and noted a date 6 months out for comprehensive program assessment. He'd brief the Admiral then with full data about whether the training and volunteer requirements had generated lasting change or simply temporary compliance. Meanwhile, Chin sat in Dr. Reynolds' office for their weekly therapy session, discussing her progress and ongoing struggles. The psychologist had noticed improvements over the past 3 weeks, subtle shifts in Chin's willingness to engage with public spaces and activities that had triggered anxiety since the range incident. "You went to the grocery store twice this week," Reynolds observed, referencing Chen's activity log. Both times during busy hours rather than early morning when fewer people were present. That's significant progress from 3 weeks ago when you were avoiding any crowded environment. Chen acknowledged the improvement but remained honest about her internal experience. It still triggers anxiety, she said. Walking into any public space makes me hyper-aware of how people might be judging me or making assumptions. But I'm doing it anyway, because staying home felt like letting that morning define my entire recovery. Reynolds made notes, recognizing the distinction between managing symptoms and being controlled by them. Have you thought more about returning to the shooting range? The question was careful, acknowledging the specific trauma site while exploring Chen's readiness to reclaim that particular space. Chen had been considering exactly that question for several days. Morrison had called twice to reiterate that her membership remained active and a private lane was available whenever she felt ready. The range had also implemented new policies about respectful conduct, prompted partly by the incident, but also by Morrison's recognition that clearer standards would benefit all shooters. I think I'm ready to try, Chen said slowly. Not because I've forgiven what happened or because the apologies fixed everything, but because that range was part of my healing before the incident, and I don't want to surrender that tool permanently. Dr. Reynolds had encouraged her to view returning as reclaiming space rather than proving anything to anyone, and that framing helped. Reynolds supported the decision while ensuring Chen approached it carefully. Start with a short session, she suggested. 30 minutes maximum. If you feel overwhelmed, you can leave immediately without judgment. The goal is reconditioning your response to that environment, not achieving perfect performance. Chen appreciated the psychologist's realistic expectations. She'd spent enough time in therapy to understand that healing wasn't linear and setbacks were normal parts of recovery. The range incident had been a significant setback, but it didn't erase the months of progress that came before it. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures, conditions similar to 3 weeks earlier when Chen had last visited Pacific Coast Range. She drove the familiar route with deliberate calm, practicing breathing techniques and reminding herself that she could leave at any moment if the environment became too triggering. Morrison saw her car pull into the parking lot and made a conscious decision not to approach immediately. He'd learned enough about trauma responses to understand that sometimes support meant giving space rather than offering attention. He simply ensured her preferred lane was available and that other shooters understood they should maintain respectful distance. Chen unpacked her rifle with mechanical precision, the familiar motions providing comfort through routine. Her hands showed minimal tremor today, the medication properly balanced after weeks of careful adjustment with her VA physician. She loaded her first magazine and took position at the 200-yard lane, the same distance where she'd struggled 3 weeks ago. The first shot surprised her with how naturally it came. No overthinking, no performance anxiety, just the trained response of acquiring target, controlling breath, and executing smooth trigger press. The round struck center mass, and Chen felt some tension release from her shoulders. She fired 9 more rounds with consistent results, each shot grouping tightly around the first. The performance validated that her skills remained intact despite the recent setback, that one bad morning hadn't erased years of training and experience. More importantly, being back at the range felt manageable rather than overwhelming, suggesting her recovery was continuing despite the temporary disruption. After 30 minutes, as Dr. Reynolds had suggested, Chen packed her equipment and prepared to leave. Morrison approached as she loaded her car, his timing careful to avoid seeming intrusive. "Good to see you back, Captain," he said simply. "Your lane is always available." Chen appreciated the straightforward acknowledgement without excessive sentiment. "Thank you for maintaining standards here," she replied, referencing the new conduct policies Morrison had implemented. "It makes a difference knowing someone's paying attention to how people treat each other." Morrison nodded, understanding that her comment extended beyond simple appreciation into recognition of institutional responsibility. The range was his to run, and he'd let problems develop that contributed to creating an environment where the incident could occur. His policy changes were partial atonement for that failure. Chen drove home, feeling cautiously optimistic about her continued recovery. The range session had gone well, confirming that she could reclaim spaces that had been temporarily lost to trauma. Dr. Reynolds would be pleased with the progress, though Chen knew the psychologist would also remind her that one successful session didn't mean all challenges were resolved. Her phone showed a notification from an unknown number. Opening the message revealed a brief text from someone identifying themselves as Stephanie Martinez, Army captain currently serving in Germany. "Your story reached me through military networks," the message read. "I wanted you to know it encouraged me to file a formal complaint about disrespectful treatment I experienced at my base. Your willingness to stand up mattered to more people than you probably realize. Thank you for your service and your courage." 6 months after the incident at Pacific Coast Range, Chen had established a comfortable routine that balanced her recovery needs with gradual reintegration into activities she'd avoided during her darkest months. The shooting range had become weekly therapy again, just as Dr. Reynolds had prescribed originally. Morrison always ensured her preferred lane was available, and the other regular shooters had learned to treat everyone with baseline respect regardless of apparent skill level or background. Chen arrived Saturday morning to find the parking lot busier than usual. A women's shooting group had reserved several lanes for their monthly gathering, 15 women of varying ages and experience levels. She recognized the nervous energy some displayed, the same tentative approach she'd seen in herself during early recovery, when public spaces felt threatening rather than welcoming. Morrison greeted her with his usual efficiency. "Captain, your lane is ready," he said, then added with slight hesitation, "The women's group coordinator asked if you might be willing to speak with them briefly." "No pressure, just thought I'd mention the request. Several of them are veterans dealing with similar challenges you've worked through." Chen considered the request carefully. 6 months ago, she would have declined immediately, unwilling to revisit trauma for strangers' benefit. But therapy had taught her that sharing experiences sometimes helped both the speaker and listeners process difficult realities. She agreed to speak after her own shooting session, giving herself time to settle into the familiar routine first. Her performance at 1,000 yards had returned to pre-incident consistency, each shot placed with the precision that came from years of training and recent months of reclaimed confidence. The meditation of controlled breathing, sight acquisition, and smooth trigger press provided the therapeutic benefit Dr. Reynolds had understood when prescribing this particular treatment approach. After completing her session, Chen joined the women's group in the range's classroom area. The coordinator introduced her simply as Captain Chen, Army Ranger veteran, letting her military background speak for itself without elaborate ceremony. Chen stood before the assembled women, recognizing varying degrees of nervousness, determination, and curiosity in their expressions. "I'm not here to give you a formal presentation," Chen began, keeping her tone conversational rather than instructional. "But I understand some of you are veterans dealing with reintegration challenges, and my story has circulated through military communities. I'm happy to answer questions or share what I've learned about recovery." A younger woman raised her hand tentatively. "I served 4 years in the Marines," she said, her voice carrying uncertainty. "I've been out for 6 months, and I feel invisible. People make assumptions about what I can do based on how I look, and when I mention my service, they either don't believe me or treat it like some exotic accomplishment instead of just my job. How do you deal with being constantly underestimated?" Chen appreciated the honesty of the question. "I don't always deal with it well," she admitted. 6 months ago, I let strangers' judgments affect my recovery badly enough that I stopped coming here for weeks. But I learned that demanding respect from people who've already decided you don't deserve it is exhausting and ultimately pointless. What matters is respecting yourself enough to keep showing up despite their assumptions." Another woman, older and wearing an Air Force veteran cap, spoke up. "I saw the videos from your incident here," she said. "I've experienced similar situations where people mock my capabilities until they learn my background. Does it bother you that respect seemed conditional on them, knowing your service record?" "That question cuts to the core issue," Chen replied. "Yes, it bothers me. Respect should be baseline, not something earned through credentials. But I also recognize that changing deeply held biases in individuals is beyond my control. What I can control is refusing to let their bias define my self-worth or limit my activities. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, women sharing experiences of dismissal, assumption, and the particular challenges of invisible service. Chen recognized common threads running through their stories, patterns of judgment based on gender, appearance, or the absence of visible military identifiers. The discussion validated that her experience at the range wasn't unique, but rather representative of broader problems many veterans faced. Morrison observed from the back of the room, noting how Chen's willingness to be vulnerable about her struggles gave others permission to acknowledge their own challenges. The range officer had learned enough about trauma and recovery to recognize therapeutic value in communal sharing, especially among people who'd served and understood the specific context of military-to-civilian transition. Meanwhile, Webb completed his 100th volunteer hour at the San Diego Veterans Community Center, a milestone that represented 5 times his mandatory requirement. The mentorship work had become genuinely important to him, not as penance for past failures, but as meaningful contribution to helping other veterans navigate difficult transitions. His current mints included a former Army specialist struggling with PTSD and unemployment, a Navy veteran dealing with service-connected disabilities, and a Marine who'd been medically retired after combat injuries. Patricia Okonkwo, the center coordinator, pulled Webb aside after the evening's mentorship session. "Lieutenant, you've gone well beyond your required service," she said with characteristic directness. "I want you to know that your mints have made measurable progress under your guidance. 2 have secured employment. All 3 report improved confidence, and they consistently cite your support as a key factor in their advancement." Webb accepted the feedback with genuine humility. "They did the work," he replied. "I just provided some perspective and accountability." But internally, he recognized that the mentorship had changed him as much as it had helped his mints. Regular interaction with veterans facing challenges he'd never experienced had generated empathy that Monday's mandatory training had introduced, but ongoing service had actually cultivated. Commander Hartley prepared his 6-month assessment report for Captain Richardson and the Admiral, compiling data that showed sustained improvement in conduct across his command. Informal complaints had remained 60% below historical averages. Joint training feedback from other services indicated significantly improved professional relationships. Volunteer hours had exceeded requirements by an average of 40%, suggesting genuine engagement rather than minimal compliance. Most importantly, follow-up surveys showed that 85% of personnel reported changed attitudes about respect, service diversity, and treatment of veterans from different backgrounds. The report acknowledged remaining challenges. Some team members had completed requirements with minimal enthusiasm, and cultural change required continued reinforcement rather than one-time training. But the overall trajectory suggested that the incident at Pacific Coast Range had generated meaningful institutional improvement that extended beyond the immediate participants. Hartley scheduled individual meetings with Webb's team to discuss their progress and future development. When Webb entered the commander's office, Hartley gestured him to sit rather than standing at attention. "Lieutenant, you've exceeded expectations in addressing the conduct incident," Hartley began. "Your volunteer work shows genuine commitment, and I've received positive feedback from multiple sources about your mentorship and changed approach to interacting with other service members." Webb accepted the recognition while remaining aware that positive performance over 6 months didn't erase his initial failure. "Sir, I appreciate the acknowledgement," he said carefully, "but I also recognize that growth from a low point isn't the same as consistent excellence. I'm still working to ensure my default responses reflect the values I claim to hold rather than requiring conscious correction." Hartley appreciated the honest self-assessment. "That awareness is exactly what I want to see," he replied. "The goal isn't perfection, but rather sustained effort toward improvement. You've demonstrated that effort, and I'm recommending you for the civilian-military cooperation assignment you were originally removed from." The community leadership position will put your changed approach into practice in ways that benefit both the Navy and local veteran communities. The conversation concluded with Webb feeling cautiously optimistic about his professional trajectory while remaining committed to the personal growth that made that trajectory possible. 6 months of work had begun changing patterns that had developed over years, but he understood the process would require continued attention. Chun left the range that afternoon, knowing she'd reclaimed something important. Not just the physical space or the therapeutic activity, but her sense of agency in determining how past trauma would affect her future. Morrison's policy changes, the women's group discussion, and her own consistent return to challenging activities all represented forms of healing that extended beyond individual recovery into communal support. Driving home, Chin thought about the message she'd received weeks earlier from Captain Martinez in Germany, and the 3 similar messages that had followed from other service members inspired to address their own experiences with disrespect. Her willingness to continue showing up despite difficulty had mattered to people she'd never met, creating ripples that extended beyond her personal recovery into broader cultural conversations about invisible service, conditional respect, and the particular challenges faced by women veterans. Whether readers found themselves in California, Texas, Florida, or anywhere else veterans navigated similar struggles, Chin's story offered validation that their experiences were real and their persistence was worthwhile. The question that had challenged Webb 6 months earlier remained relevant. Would it have mattered if they'd known? The answer, Chun had learned, was that demanding conditional respect was less important than maintaining unconditional self-respect. That distinction made all the difference in recovery and resilience.